Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. A deep dive on the pod today into what's become a political hot topic, but always been something of great interest to me: retirement security and pensions. The Bloc Québécois is threatening to trigger an early election over Bill C-319, a bill that would raise old age security payments for seniors between the ages of 65 and 74 by 10%. Today, I want to step back and examine the whole area from a policy perspective, unlike the political context in which it's been entirely debated in the House of Commons. And so we've brought back the vaunted Herle Burly Policy Panel, making their fifth appearance on the podcast and always among our most listened to shows. Sean Speer, Dr. Jennifer Robson, and Tyler Meredith. Tyler's the former head of fiscal and economic policy for Prime Minister Trudeau and Ministers of Finance Chrystia Freeland and Bill Morneau. Today he's a founding partner at Meredith Boessenkool Policy Advisors. I think there's a third name in there now, isn't it? Meredith Boessenkool Phillips Policy Advisors. Jennifer has held senior roles in policy development and research with the federal government. She's now program director and associate professor of political management at Carleton University. And Sean is a former senior economic advisor to Prime Minister Harper. Today, he's senior fellow at U of T's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He's also a founder and editor-at-large at thehub.ca, to which I subscribe and suggest you do. So, here's a roadmap of what I hope to cover today. What's the financial position of current and soon-to-be retirees? Do they need this kind of help? How does an expanded CPP, which was agreed to about a decade ago, impact on this? What was the government's rationale for increasing OAS payments from 75 older and not from 65 up? And how is the RRSP system and retirement savings working writ large in the country? And is there any way we can get people saving more? Probably other stuff we're going to get into, but let's cover that waterfront at least. Jennifer, Sean, Tyler, welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us back. And David, I should just clarify, I'm on sabbatical, so I'm not currently the director of my program. And I should also say thank you to Sean.
What are you doing on here then? For God's sake, you're unemployed.
I know, I should be like on a beach somewhere. But I also should say thank you to Sean, who is now teaching in the NPM program this year, including teaching my policy students. So just wanted to say that.
They're very lucky to have both of you.
We're deeply into Kevin Bacon territory here. Speaking of bacon, Jennifer, any big plans for Thanksgiving? We're recording this on the eve of Thanksgiving.
That's right. Yeah, I have to go and find turkey parts after we're done here. We're not doing a big full turkey. I have to find turkey breast because there's not enough of us meat eaters in the house now. That's the big plan.
Those breasts are more difficult to stuff, though.
I'll figure it out. I'll be all right.
You guys, Thanksgiving plans?
I'm just going to see my partner's extended family in Kingston, but other than that, we're just kicking around Ottawa.
You sound enthusiastic about that. Jesus.
I don't think they listen to this podcast. Hopefully not.
Tyler, you and your partner are welcome to come for turkey if you
want. I'm coming to you, David, from New York City, where I live with my family these days. And so, of course, we're not celebrating Thanksgiving for a while, which means that Monday is going to be the most productive day of the year for me because we have our nanny. Childcare is in full effect, and I'm not going to have people sending me emails and texts from Canada. So, watch out for my Twitter account. My thumbs are going to be moving fast and furious come Monday.
So what? The Hub, the CBC, you have to live in New York City to cover Canada these days?
Catherine Tate and I get together once a month to catch up, as you can imagine.
All right, let's get into this. So this conversation is sparked obviously by the Bloc Québécois motion to increase the payments to the level of 675 and over for those 65 and over. Let's start with this question, Tyler. I'll put it to you. Is there a problem here for public policy to solve? Whether or not this particular proposal has merits, are they attempting to solve a problem that needs solving?
So I think you can look at it a couple of ways. It's probably not the best use of government dollars and spending dollars that you could be deploying on problems like building housing or even securing our defenses, which are massive problems that the public treasury has to deal with. But if the question is, are seniors potentially at risk as they age? and at risk of running out of cash as they age, do we need to think about that? The answer is potentially yes, because things like the cost of care are rising over time. But should we be giving a generalized boost to all seniors that goes to about 95% of seniors, including people who have, six-figure incomes and dual six-figure incomes potentially, and spreading all of that cash in a lot of different directions as of the age of 65? Probably not. And I think what's been interesting to watch about this debate, and we'll get into the rationale for why there is currently a boost at the age of 75 and not at the age of 65. But it was interesting to watch as this debate has played out. There is an obvious political benefit that often accrues to political parties for giving more cash to seniors. But because of the intergenerational issues that we now face, because of the expensiveness of our housing market and so forth, we're actually starting to see political parties, I think, to a certain extent, reevaluate that question, because we've seen some parties, including the Conservatives, step back from supporting that. And I think it speaks to an interesting moment that we're in public policy.
Yeah. I want to get back to that because that's a really interesting point. But let me hear first from Jennifer and Sean about whether or not they think the intended recipients of the Bloc's motion need the help. Jennifer?
Okay. Well, let's start by talking about poverty rates and comparing that by age group. So right now it's 6% of seniors are living below Canada's official poverty rate. That's about 430,000 out of seven and a bit million of them. In Quebec, the population is aging faster. So just as a share of their overall voting population, they have more seniors. Interestingly enough, though, actually in Quebec, the rate of poverty amongst seniors is half the national rate. It's just under 3%. The vast majority of seniors are living above the level at which we have decided collectively that this is sort of an acceptable standard of living. There are some who are struggling. They tend to be disproportionately seniors who are living by themselves. There is an overrepresentation of women, but again, we're talking about 430 out of 7.3 million. So I wrote a piece that was out earlier today in Policy Options and sort of made the comparison here of it's like taking an elephant gun to try and shoot a fly. It's a little overpowered for the nature of the problem here. So especially when you consider that when we talk about OAS, there's already a built-in, more targeted top-up through the guaranteed income supplement, and it is a little kind of unusual that the BQ hasn't talked about that or indicated any openness there. And the other thing I would just say is while we're talking about the fiscal impact of this over sort of, the 5-year time horizon that the PBO was able to cost, let's not forget that we're in a rapidly aging population and seniors are a bigger and bigger share of our population. They're going to be living for a very long time. Yeah, absolutely. Their needs need to be met. But, the fiscal impact of this is not just the next 5 years. It is the next 30, 40, 50 and beyond.
David, as Jennifer said, I'm stepping in this semester and teaching her class, and you can see what big shoes I have to fill. There's something inherently unfair of following her in the classroom and then following up with a well-conceived answer like that. Tyler and Jennifer
She brought the receipts.
Yeah, precisely. Exactly right. And I think my response will be free of receipts in a way, which is to say, I think there is a question here about what collective interest we have in outcomes for people as they enter their senior years. We do have some collective interest, of course, of protecting against seniors' poverty, ensuring a basic level of resources, and the purpose of the OAS and the GIS and the CPP and the broader retirement income system is to meet that basic threshold. But at some point, David, that collective interest starts to diminish. I mean, if people want to have the ability to go on extra trip each year, or to have some particular luxury goods or something like that, that is an inherently personal or private interest. It's not one for which they can make a claim on public resources or a sense of collective responsibility. And I say all that because at the heart of a lot of these debates goes to some fundamental questions which really date back to debates we've been having, for better part of 20 or 30 years. I remember, for instance, the report that Jack Mintz did for the government of Canada on these questions of retirement income security, what the right income replacement rate ought to be as a basis for public policy making. And there's a lot of debate about what that replacement rate ought to be. And at some level, it seems to me, it's rooted in a fundamental disagreement about at what point collective responsibility ends and personal responsibility begins. And I guess as a conservative, my instinct is a lot of those, including ostensibly the BQ, arguing for greater resources for our seniors, have an expansive view relative to my own about what my responsibility or what our collective responsibility is to Canada's seniors population.
Right. Well, I'm sort of caught up between two thoughts here because I have just a little bit of information. I know from the work I'm currently doing on food insecurity in the country that food insecurity is highest among people under the age of 35, but exists in Canada at a pretty consistent level of about 15% to 20% through all age groups until you hit 65 plus, when it almost disappears entirely, when somewhere around 3% of respondents report that they are food insecure. And I presume that is because of the GIS and the fact that people over the age of 65 are the only Canadians that effectively have a basic income, basic minimum income in the country. So that's one thought in my head. But the other thought was, years ago, Tyler, before the CPP expansion, I was doing a lot of work in this area. But by work, I mean public opinion work and understanding. And I was working for a couple of pension funds, and I did some work for the Ontario government. And what I was seeing there was that the people that were approaching retirement were dreadfully first of all, the people under the age of 40 or 45 hadn't even given any thought to retirement and retirement income. But people over the age of 50 were dreadfully unprepared financially for their retirement. Many, many people between 55 and 65 had more debt than they had savings as they approached that notional retirement age. And so I assumed at that point that we were heading for a pretty major problem among seniors. So, Jennifer, you touched on this, but where do they level out in terms of a person that doesn't have a pension plan, say from their employer? How are they doing?
Right. So, well, I mean, if the question is how are they doing while they're in working age in terms of savings, specifically savings for retirement, not amazing. So more receipts for you. It's a little more than 2/3 of working age households. This is at the household level. So maybe somebody like, one partner or the other or whatever, somebody had an RRSP at some point, but actually on an annual basis, it's more like 1/3 of tax filers are actually making a regular contribution. And, another important share of those actually already have a pension. So in a sense, it's like we've got a group of people who have both the belt and the suspenders, and then we've got a bigger group of people who have nothing whatsoever. And just, Sean's point about Jack Mintz's work back in around sort of 2007, 2008 brought me back to some work I was doing when I was in government at the time. It reminded me that when you actually ask working age adults, how are you preparing for your retirement? A huge number of them will say my house, right? Yeah. Like the housing assets have become a big part of how people think about and plan for their retirement. And it has worked well for a big cohort of current seniors who are disproportionately likely to live in a house or housing that they own. And if they do, they're very unlikely to have a mortgage and they're very unlikely to have other debt. So even if their income isn't necessarily super high, their ongoing costs are quite low, and their fiscal, their personal financial capacity to leverage some of those assets is actually pretty darn good. And I do worry, right, about that, the sustainability of that way of thinking about retirement savings. We've tried things like increasing the tax incentives for private savings. We've tried creating new savings vehicles, and none of it seems to have really stuck. So if anything, it's sort of like we have to think about the fact that people have about a kind of a finite capacity of what it is that they're going to be socking away for long-term savings.
Yeah.
They're constantly struggling with the need for short-term savings, and sort of adding a few more bells and whistles it's probably just moving, from this pot to this one over here instead.
So it was in this space last week where I was pondering this seemingly odd notion of our presenting sponsor Tellus, a technology company, getting into home building in a rather large way. Seemingly is the operative word here, Herle Burly-ites, because frankly, it ain't really all that odd. And I'll tell you why. It goes back to values, as everything with Tellus's business does. The initiative is called Tellus Living, if you recall, which strikes me as a good name because it's a perfect example of, Tellus living their values to improve the quality of life in the communities they serve through innovation. In this case, addressing the housing crisis by leveraging their advanced fiber network to build smart homes within mixed-use, purpose-built rental residential properties that represent a unique value proposition in the housing market. These are living spaces the working middle class can afford within 40% of their household income level. So they line up with Tellus's broader commitment to community investment and social responsibility. You know what else? They support Tellus's sustainability goals because each of the 3 kickoff developments in BC, Nanaimo, Seychelles, and Saanich, promote green building practices, reducing environmental impact and contributing to long-term business growth and resilience. This is nothing less than Tellus redefining residential living, Herle Burly-ites, creating forward-looking, vibrant, and connected communities. Shovels in the ground, values at the foundation. We'll wind up this series next week, but for now, go to tellusliving.com to find out more.
Well, and that's exactly, I think Jen has hit the nail on the head. That is exactly the public policy problem, because if you look at people who are in a defined contribution pension plan or a defined benefit pension plan where they don't have to make the decisions about how they invest. It's invested on their behalf. It comes right off the check. It's done by somebody else. Versus those who are, in their own RRSP. They might get a contribution from their employer, but they're effectively on their own to decide how they invest the money. The research would suggest that the individual investor can potentially, and does in certain cases, match the overall replacement rates that someone in a workplace pension plan has, except that's a very small number of people who actually do achieve that. Why? Because most of the time it requires a degree of attention and financial literacy that a lot of people do not have. And so if we are thinking about how do we design systems for the 80 or 90% of people and their natural behaviors that the 80 or 90% of us, who lead busy lives and have lots of other expenses that they've got to manage in their household budget, that doesn't work for most people. And so you've got to think about what makes saving easier, right? And the decline of workplace pension plans in Canada, right? About less than 40% of Canadians are currently enrolled in a workplace pension plan, means that Canadians are on their own more or less to do their savings. And so unless they have access to low cost, high performing funds and are able to save on a regular basis and do so very efficiently and do so in the right sets of things where, for example, banks aren't sending them into inferior products, right? Which is a real problem in our marketplace today. You're going to get inferior retirement savings outcomes. And one of the challenges that we face in Canada is that because we live in a high, expensive housing market, we just have fewer financial resources to set aside and save. And so the natural savings rates for Canadians is among the lowest in the G7. And that's really the problem that things like the expansion of the Canada Pension Plan have been meant to solve for. It's the fact that we just undersave as a country. And at a risk, long-term, that those future consumption possibilities as we have an older population are going to be a drag on our economic growth.
Tyler, you left off, though, if I could just say for a second, Sean. Tyler, you left off the most important thing about savings, which is then young people won't save for their retirement. Like and we had this fight when Wynne was setting up the Ontario Retirement Pension Plan, and a lot of her advisors wanted it to be optional, the Ontario Retirement Pension Plan. And I said, if it's optional, young people will opt out. No 30-year-old voluntarily puts away money for their retirement.
It has to be compulsory.
Has to be compulsory. or they start too late for it to add up. They don't understand compound interest, or they don't have the money, or both.
Yeah,
Right.
I think the point about finite resources is a key one, of course. The Trudeau government is experimenting with a bunch of different policy innovations to try to help people save for down payments. So you think of kind of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have shelter needs in the immediate term, student loan debt that is immediate term priority draw on your household budget, and then you have the long term horizon challenges that you face. I just want to pick up on something Tyler said, because I think his point about employer pensions is an important one. It's not lost on listeners that we've seen a major transformation in defined benefit or even defined contribution plans across the employment landscape. And there's reason to think that that's probably only going to continue down that path when you think of new forms of employment relationships. We're moving more in a direction like an Uber driver than we are in a direction of a unionized manufacturing worker. And so in that sense, I think there is a role for public policy to try to figure out, in the absence of those traditional plans, what can government do to try to support alternative arrangements. I think it's mostly failed, but the Harper government sought to do that when it advanced the notion of pool registered pension plans, to try to essentially create a new model that would sit somewhere between a conventional defined benefit plan and the more individualistic one that Tyler and Jennifer were referring to rather. As I say, I think in hindsight, outcomes were disappointing, but I think it represented a kind of good faith effort to try to get at that fundamental issue, because I think in the absence of that, a lot of these other marginal policies that we've seen around tax incentives and different types of new savings vehicles ultimately risk kind of just shifting money around as opposed to creating a kind of net increase in Canadians' retirement savings.
Let's talk about these pensions for a few minutes, Jennifer. I'm old enough that I was a young person working in Mark Lalone's office when the RRSP system was really being introduced, and people were excited about this tax saving vehicle and all this kind of stuff. But I don't think that people at the time understood that the entire risk of retirement was being transferred from their employer to themselves. And there is no evidence that I have seen that people have taken up that challenge. When I last knew, there were billions and billions and billions of unused RRSP room in Canada. So it is not that we went from one system, one way of doing it to another. We went from a way of doing it to not doing it. How did that all come about? Do you know the history? Why did we do
David, you're asking me about my dissertation research. And I know the exact budget that you were talking about that you worked on in Lalonde's office. That would have been the major expansion following the Royal Commission on taxation. But actually, RRSPs go back to the 1950s, and they were a post-war creation on based on the advocacy of doctors, lawyers, and dentists who said, "Hey, now that there's this tax measure to encourage employer-based pensions, we want some parity here," right? So it was meant for the professional classes. And then it was relatively modest, honestly, for many, many years. Believe it or not, nobody remembers this, but in that Royal Commission on Taxation, the recommendation was actually to reduce the RRSP annual contribution room. Everybody always forgets that part. Anyway, but what you saw pretty quickly was that it expanded in terms of people who were actually taking up these new instruments. It expanded pretty quickly beyond the self-employed workers into just more generally sort of the higher income ranges, which is what we see today, right? Like I was saying before about how there's that area of about, kind of a third of the people who have either a pension or RSPs who actually have both, like those belt and suspenders folks. in many respects, like those are the people who are benefiting most from the system. There's the most slack and room for them in terms of the contributions. They get the biggest bang in terms of the annual deduction. They're also the ones that can get access to the best and fancy tax advice and plan ahead for the time that when they turn 65, they can figure out, how do I move the money around so that I'm maximizing the decline in my taxable income to manage all of these different assets that I have. But in another respect, we've also given RRSPs way too many jobs, right? Like it is,
Yes.
it for a long time was
Yes.
the thing that wasn't just for your retirement. It was also like, okay, this is the vehicle that you use for your house. Oh, you want to go back to school? Okay, well, this is also your lifelong learning plan. But it's also become this like sort of weird rainy day savings that people dip into, even if a TFSA would be better for them, right? It's, I looked up the numbers today. It's 25% say that they have an RRSP that they have withdrawn money from and probably paid taxes on because they didn't do it under one of the tax shelters. So there's stuff there in terms of thinking about, do we have the right tax incentives? In terms of the mix between RRSPs and TFSAs, are we giving people the right signals? Is the financial services sector actually equipped to give people good advice on this stuff? And if people actually need access to that sort of like more medium-term savings, maybe that actually deserves some support as well, so that we can kind of let the long-term retirement savings thing really be just for that, right? And then you were talking before about the behavioral aspect of this. It has to be mandatory, right? So if you create opportunities for it to kind of be more locked in, then people can't touch it, which is actually one of the, sorry.
Yeah, one thing I'd add, David, which reflects my own professional experience over the past decade or so. Since I left politics in 2015, I've had different forms of unconventional work. I sometimes when people ask me, I say I have a work portfolio, which is to say I'm in some cases I have a T4 employment with different organizations. In other cases, I'm serving as a contractor. And this experience has caused me to rethink some of my assumptions related to issues around pensions and retirement income security. I was a pretty big skeptic, for instance, of the CPP increase back in 2015, 2016. In fact, I think if you Googled me, you'd find different writings arguing against it. But I have come to place a high emphasis or value on simplicity that I don't think I appreciated at the time. My income taxes are complicated. My investments are much more complicated. The fact that I'm spending time in Canada, the US, obviously only reinforces that complexity. And so I do think one thing that policymakers need to spend more time focused on when they're doing policy design and implementation is the question of simplicity. I think if I were to go back into policymaking or politics, I would be prepared to live with a lot of different trade-offs if it came with the benefit of simplicity. And so for that reason, I think kind of in hindsight, I think if I could go back with knowing what I know now, I probably would have supported the mandatory increase in the CPP and be thinking about how do you sort of shoot through this principle of simplicity through a broader range of retirement income security programs.
Yeah, interesting. So, as they say in the North, winter is coming. Put a little more lyrically, the end of summer has arrived and passed, the palette of colors has changed, and we are all trying to enjoy the last bits of warmth. Soon enough, life will become more difficult. Our sponsor, CN, knows better than most what winter means. The railway produces a formal winter plan each year, detailing how it intends to cope with polar temperatures. As the railway's CEO, Tracy Robson, puts it in this year's plan, when one operates the most northerly Class 1 railway in North America, one does what one must to keep the trains running during winter. That's Canadian understatement. Within a few months, CN trains will be rolling through some of the bitterest climates on Earth. Extreme cold basically attacks anything mechanical. Ice crystals can actually cut into steel wheels and train tracks. Rails become more brittle. Gaskets fail. Hoses freeze. And air brakes will break down if not scrupulously maintained. That last issue is the most serious. CN engineers have spent endless hours trying to figure out how to protect and boost the efficiency of air brakes, helping them slow a train's massive inertia in what railways call Tier 3 weather, meaning minus 36 Celsius or colder. The solution is air cars, rolling compressors spaced along the length of the train to boost air pressure and braking efficiency. Since air cars were invented in 2006, CN has spent tens of millions of dollars installing them in winter, along with winter-prepped locomotives that can achieve more traction. Also this year, CN is deploying the latest generation of AI-equipped rail cars that deploy ground-penetrating radar to inspect tracks at speed. To paraphrase a famous cyclist, it never gets easier. But with the right combination of gear and training, you can go faster. Speaking of simplicity, there's nothing more simple than a defined benefit plan through your employer. And I presume that everybody in Canada would sleep a little bit better at night if they had one of those things. When I worked for some defined benefit pension plans some years ago, they told me that it was no more expensive for an employer to offer a defined benefit plan than a defined contribution plan. That the difference was who absorbed the risk of shortfall. So Tyler, is there a way to address that so that we could get defined benefit plans back into the private sector where they've almost disappeared entirely?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question, because if you look at the experience in the last 2 decades, we've seen two kind of very different outcomes around pension plans. So as a result of what happened and the big shock that happened to pension plans, like everyone who was invested in the stock market after the 08-09 financial crisis, a lot of our pension plans, defined benefit pension plans at both the federal and provincial level, sustained huge losses, right? In terms of the amount that they need to have and set aside in order to pay out those future benefits that they've committed effectively as a contract to offer to people when you go into them. And you saw for a long period, from about 2009 until about 2016-17, a lot of plans struggling in order to kind of meet their solvency requirements, and governments doing a whole bunch of different things in order to provide flexibility to those plans so that we would just kind of ignore, frankly, the risk that was there that those plans might not might not be able to meet those benefits. And a number of large employers actually closed their plans because they just didn't want to have to carry the risk on their balance sheet, and it created a financing problem for those companies, right? But lo and behold, what did we see? Of course, over time, as market conditions change, as the stock market does better, as those plans get invested in other forms of investment that yield different returns that are not correlated with the stock market, solvency ratios actually increased quite a bit. And defined benefit pension plans actually returned to a period where they were quite healthy. And today, in fact, many of our defined benefit pension plans are quite healthy in a way that we haven't seen in the last number of decades. And so it's interesting because we got to a point where governments were trying to experiment with different ways of creating hybrid plans or trying to introduce different alternatives to potentially put a portion of your benefits at risk. The reality was maybe we didn't need to do those things, right? Over time, some of these problems would correct. And part of that, and it's interesting, the last point I'll make here, David, is I think we have not been fast enough to keep up with the fact that the trends in the labor market are also changing. And so as you think about those risks, right, if people work a little bit longer, if they happen to be attached to work a little bit more over time, which has been a massive change under the surface that started to happen in our labor market as more older people have worked longer, yes, partly because they're healthier, that fundamentally changes the long-term actuarial assumptions that programs, not only in pension plans like defined benefit plans, but also in things like OAS and how sustainable those plans look over time.
What do you think, Jennifer, about whether or not there could be a resurgence of defined benefit pensions?
Great question. I also just want to throw in a gender curve on this one, which is that where we've seen the greatest declines in terms of pension coverage has actually been amongst working age men. They are more likely to be working in the private sector. And so there's sort of this interesting dynamic at the household level. If you think about sort of a heterosexual couple of a man and a woman living together and planning ahead, where you've got more women who now actually have access to pension coverage than men. And in many respects, it's because they're overrepresented in the public sector. So it's, in some respects, we're sort of seeing this in terms of self-selection of where people are working, maybe. But possibility of expansion of DB plans beyond just like continuing to grow the public sector. I'm taking it that's not kind of one of the options on the table that we want to even ponder.
It's a bigger conversation.
It's a much bigger conversation. Public service for everyone. But
10 more years and we'll get there by the sort of the trend. Oh, Tyler's going to have graphs on Twitter for me after this.
I mean, I really appreciated Tyler's point about sort of the changing market conditions and how that has really altered the sustainability of the DB plans. But I really appreciate Sean's point about the experimentation that the Harper government tried to make in terms of the pooled vehicle. Because you could kind of almost imagine a merging of, like your chocolate fell into my peanut butter, where maybe there's actually opportunities for thinking about how do you create dialogues amongst employers so that they can use the vehicle of the pooled plan. And then, you help them understand the feasibility over the longer term in terms of the capitalization of the DB model. I still think, there are going to be the outliers. There's still a role here for the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions in terms of oversight and monitoring. That's really important. And also, important things for the members of the plans to know that there are good backstops for them. So look, I don't know that there's a way to force companies to do this, but look, if we're entering into a tighter labor market, this is also part of how we should be thinking about the overall bargaining power of labor, right? That there's going to be some wage gains, but some of it is also total compensation, and that should be part of the conversation too.
So yeah, I was just going to say there's two, in my mind, labor dynamics at play. One that perhaps tilts in a future where defined benefit plans are more plausible and present, and one where I think they're less so. And in the first case, it's precisely what Jennifer just outlined. In a world in which workers have more bargaining power, in theory, that should be reflected in an increase in total compensation, the mix of which is obviously subject to negotiations between employers and employees. And in that case, perhaps you see employers start to preference some share of their total compensation being reflected in pension plans, and that becomes, in effect, a kind of comparative advantage for firms that are competing for scarce labor. The scenario, though, where I think it's less plausible is the one I mentioned earlier. It just seems to me we are moving, that the share of the population moving in the direction of unconventional work is still relatively small, but it looks to me like it's growing. And in that context, that relationship between workers and employers is just different in a way that things like defined benefit plans, the economics of them may make less sense. I say all of that against a backdrop in which this week the Senate passed the government's pharmacare legislation. I think the strongest argument one can make for pharmacare, of which I'm a critic, is that although the share of the population that is presently covered through a combination of employer-provided plans and public plans is pretty high, that share may fall over time in a world in which more and more people are in unconventional work arrangements and not getting employer-provided health and dental benefits. I think in a way, the government, through its pharmacare legislation, is almost betting on that second future where as the relationship between employees and employers change, the government is going to have to step in and fill some of the roles that employers have historically provided, including with respect to health and dental, but in theory, that would apply as well to pensions.
So, Sean, just to stick with you for a sec, if private savings fails to prepare people properly, they will turn to government. And there are powerful political organizations. So I presume from your perspective on the world, you would rather encourage private savings, adequate private savings. So how do you see that coming about, perhaps?
Well, so I'd make 2 points, maybe three. The first is, the premise is right. Second, it involves some combination of the current mix of tax incentives and other programs, and then and relatedly trying to work through how to increase the share of people who have some type of employer arrangement, including, as I mentioned, some of the different models that governments have experimented with. But the third comes back to the very first point I made, which is I also think we need to, at a more fundamental level, have a debate about where collective responsibility begins and ends, and where personal responsibility begins and ends. As I say, I think one of the problems with Blanchette's and the Bloc Québécois motion is it presumes that we have a greater collective responsibility in outcomes for seniors than I certainly do. And I think that those questions about the role of public policy in achieving particular replacement rates is really fundamental, I think, to understanding the when public policy can say enough. We've accomplished our collective responsibility, and thereafter people are on their own.
Yeah. Tyler, you had something to say?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, so, because I think Sean is right that there is a real debate in this country about where the collective and the personal responsibility start and stop. So I would ask Sean, like, when we increased the Canada Pension Plan and the obvious increase that had on the mandatory contributions from employers and workers, would you regard that as a tax or not? Because there's an interesting debate there, which has played out in the public domain about whether or not those things should be characterized as a tax increase.
I don't know how I'd respond to that. There, as you know, at least as well or better than me, there's research on, say, the employment effects of different types of different forms of contributions and payroll taxes versus other forms of contributions. And so in that sense, it is a tax. For the purposes of understanding it through that lens, it's not a tax in the sense that obviously it doesn't go into general revenues. I probably don't have a satisfactory answer, but I guess maybe at its core, to the extent that I had criticisms of the mandatory increase, which, as I said, I think in hindsight I probably were overstated. I don't think I ever made the principal case that it was a tax, if that makes sense.
No, fair enough. No, fair enough.
Yeah.
Because I think you're.
It's language right almost exclusively used by people that are opposed to the CPP.
That's right.
Right. Tyler, while we're handling tough questions around, the government did increase the OAS payments for people over the age of 75.
Yes.
But not for people from 65 to 75. What's the rationale for that?
So there is a public policy rationale. There's also a political rationale, and those two things actually do go together. So in preparing the 2019 platform for the Liberal Party of Canada, obviously, like a lot of political parties, we were looking at how to best help seniors, knowing that we'd already done the increase to the Canada Pension Plan. And as you rightly noted, David, the increase to the Canada Pension Plan, fortunately or unfortunately, only helps basically future workers, young people, right? Because it phases in over a period of 40 years. So if you want to help seniors, what are you offering them potentially? And if you look at the research, there was a very interesting paper that was done by Ross Finney at the University of Ottawa and David Gray and Zhang in 2013 in Canadian public policy that looked at recipient use of the guaranteed income supplement. So effectively a proxy for who are the lowest income seniors over time. And that research showed that effectively if you look at the use of GIS over ages within retirement across cohorts, what you see is this effect where the poverty rate among seniors goes through a phase of dropping from about 65 through to the mid 70s because you're relatively still healthy as a senior. You've paid off your mortgage potentially. You're starting to use some of your financial assets, but you're still in a very good position, right? But then it starts to increase, kind of very, very unidirectionally from about the early 70s through to the 80s. And by the middle 70s, it's actually increased quite a bit. And so what that's reflecting is the fact that people are starting to run through their own personal savings by that point in time in their age, but they're also starting to experience the increase in costs, especially associated with care, right? As they get older and they may need to go into to private long-term care. And so in reflection of that problem, at the time, the Liberal Party of Canada said, we will increase OAS, which obviously goes to a whole whack of people, not just the guaranteed income supplement. And we will increase that starting at the age of 75. So not as of 65, because we don't think that there's a justification for it, because poverty rates are actually starting to fall during that period of time. But we'll do it at the age of 75 effectively as an insurance against the possibility that you start to draw down your assets. Now, I think a legitimate criticism can be made to say, well, if that's the problem that you care about, maybe you should have just focused on GIS, to which I would say, yes. However, there's a lot of people just above the GIS eligibility threshold who are still modest income seniors who are at risk of poverty in the same way. They just don't show up as GIS recipients. So it really was, David, from that perspective, trying to provide a degree of insurance about the fact that over time, as you age, you may age faster than your retirement savings do.
Right. Jennifer, go ahead, Sean.
Well, the only thing I was going to say was, so far in the conversation, I think what you've heard from the three of us is actually a high degree of convergence on thinking through some of the different factors that are affecting current seniors and the role of public policy to support them. But as importantly, and arguably more importantly, thinking longer term about how to support people such that we're not facing major pressures as they retire. I think we'd be remiss, though, if we took for granted that the current panoply of programs that supports older Canadians ought to be sacrosanct. That is to say that there's no scope for change or reform that incidentally could free up resources either to be reinvested in this particular cohort or across the age distribution. Just to give one example, I've always thought it was peculiar that we have a tax credit that really is designed to reward people for being 65 or older, in the form of the age credit, which incidentally carries a pretty big price tag. It's untargeted. It's a good example of where I think, if setting aside politics for a minute, if you were thinking about how to design an optimal system to support retirement income savings through the age distribution, and then meet our collective responsibility to older Canadians, something like the age credit, would ostensibly go. And there are other policies like that, David, presently in place, that when you think of a world of fiscal scarcity, we're allocating resources to people who arguably don't need them. As controversially is the income thresholds and the phase outs for old age security itself. There are a lot of. Tyler said that his in-laws don't listen to this podcast. I'm taking for granted my grandparents don't listen to this podcast. But there's a difficult public policy case that my grandparents in Thunder Bay, who are also drawing on my grandfather's pretty generous defined pension plan and pension income splitting and the age credit and so on and so forth, ought to also be receiving full old age security. So I guess that's a long way of saying, yes, we need to support seniors. Yes, we should be doing more. But as a geriatric millennial, I feel obliged to speak up for my cohort and say there's a lot of fiscal waste or misallocation involved here as well.
All right. Can I just do a quick chase on that one? Is that okay?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So this is, again, just one of those, okay, we're going to be in violent agreement on this because, it's important to remember the age credit is something that we inherited from a time when seniors in Canada represented a very small share of the population. Sadly, actually, their life expectancies were not that long, right? So sort of at the time that this was created, a congratulations, you made it to 65 probably made a lot more sense, right? And then, when you stack on top of that some of the other measures that Sean mentioned, like the pension income splitting, the pension income credit, and then there's other things that seniors, they're not exclusively meant for seniors, but seniors are vastly more likely to claim them, like the medical expenses and the disability tax credit, so forth. I ran the numbers, and basically you have to get up to the fifth decile of income before, if you're over 65, that you're actually paying any net federal and provincial income tax in this country. Jesus. Right? Like that's That's pretty up there. And even once you get into those other deciles, like the top 50%, the effective rates are they're impressively low, right? So yeah, I think maybe it's time that we have a conversation about this overall balance. And that Sean raised the point about the OAS clawback threshold. It's now up at over $90,000 this year in terms of your total net world income, which puts you into like the top 10%, right, of seniors' income in this country. I think in the future reality that we're facing demographically, it's harder and harder to justify some of these things. I realize this. I'm going to get a mean message from my dad after this, but anyway, I just needed to say it.
Tyler wants to jump in.
Yeah, can I just say? So look, as a fellow geriatric millennial, I would say, obviously there are intergenerational fairness questions that the design of these programs raises. And I think the debate that we're seeing on the OAS proposal from the Bloc is starting to bring those to the fore. But I think we would be a bit misguided if we take the view from all of this that there's a public finance problem associated with seniors overall. And the reason I say that is because I think it's been fascinating to watch what's happened with the evolution, even just within the OAS program over time, in the space of 15 years, in terms of the sustainability of that program. So if you go back and look at the actuarial reports that the Chief Actuary of Canada has prepared on the OAS, and you go back and look at the report in 2009, which is the last report that's prepared just before the Harper government proposes to increase the eligibility age from 65 to 67, because there's this concern the program is going to grow too big and it's going to cost too much for people over time, right? They were forecasting that the cost of OAS in 2050 would be about 3.1% of GDP, so rising quite a bit over time. Okay, today it's about 2.5%, just for context. And the effect of having increased that eligibility age from 65 to 67 would make less expensive OAS by about 30 basis points of GDP. So instead of being 3.1, we'd be at about 2.8, okay? And what's happened over that period of time, if you now look at the last actuarial report that was just filed by the chief actuary just last year, we are actually now forecasting that in 2050, instead of being at 3.1 or 2.8, we're actually going to be at about just over 2.5. And why is that, right? Think about what's happened in that period of time. We've rolled back the eligibility age from 67 to 65. So we've put back onto the public expense treasury all of those costs. And we've added these other new costs associated with the boost, which at age 75, which is about another 10 basis points of GDP. The reason we've had still in that period of time a massive improvement in the cost relative to the forecast is entirely explained by the fact that older workers are participating much more in the labor force today. So if there's one thing that we can do that will make these things less costly over time and more intergenerationally fair, it's not by taking benefits away or by changing the distribution of the benefits between generations. It's about enabling a longer form of participation, more active form of participation in the labor market. You change that, you will change massively the fiscal context that we're facing.
Recognizing that some seniors are not going to be able to participate, right? And in some forms of labor that they've engaged in are just not available to them. I mean, that was part of the big rationale for rolling back from 67 to 65. Right. And I think that also then kind of gets us into the question around, it's not just about like, the tax and transfer stuff. It's also about thinking through, bless you, like the services piece here as well, right?
So Jennifer, I just want to stick with you. Jennifer, I want to ground this because it feels to me like we're starting to slip away to talk about people that have some means here. If you're 80 years old and all you have is OAS, GIS, and CPP, how are you living? And what are your care prospects?
Right. Number one, it depends a lot. Do you live in a home that you own or not? If you own the home, that gives you some greater flexibilities. How you're living also depends an awful lot on, do you live close to family who are going to be doing an awful lot of unpaid care for you? Increasingly, that is not the case, right? So what are your care prospects? If you are somebody that is going to be dependent on the public system to be able to access personal support workers or opportunities to have changes made to your home so that it's safe for you to age in place, it's not looking great, right, in terms of your opportunity to qualify for some of those programs, but also the waiting times and what you can actually expect out of the system for that. So I would just say, like, when we think about like how are you living in quality of life, I think we need to think about access to the resources beyond just the income. So you might be living above the poverty line, especially if you're living in housing that you own. If you have only those income resources. But in terms of thinking through what are some of the other needs that you might have, there are going to be some challenges, and not necessarily challenges that $800 more a year in OAS is going to fix for you, because if the services just don't exist, your $800 is probably not going to buy you the PSW services that you need.
Sean, what do you do with that information and turn it around into that collective responsibility versus private responsibility framework?
Well, it's exactly where I was going to go, at the risk of sounding like a broken record. I'm a one-hit wonder on today's show. But Jen's point about the broader panoply of programs and services, I totally accept and agree with. I don't diminish that at all. But for the particular person you just outlined, David, their income replacement relative to their employment life would be pretty high, ostensibly. If what they're eligible for is the full suite of OAS, GIS, and some form of CPP, they're not experiencing a major drop in their income relative to their working life. And so it comes back to my point, like, is the expectation, is a collective obligation or collective responsibility that we see people actually experience net gains in their income relative to their life in the labor force? That strikes me as an unreasonable expectation. We ought to be ensuring something approaching, whatever percentage of their income replacement we think is reasonable. And then, thereafter, there's some combination of personal responsibility and, as Jen says, a broader panoply of public supports outside of the income support regime to meet their needs.
Tyler, what do you think?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, so I would just go back to 2 points. One is, if you look at the rationale behind increasing the Canada Pension Plan, it started from the fact that as you forecast out people's future replacement rates, as Sean mentions, over time, we were likely to experience a drop in those replacement rates because the current generation of workers were just not saving at the level possible. And they're not saving at the level possible because of a bunch of things. One is things are very expensive. 2, they're living longer. And so if you live longer, you also have to save more over time, right? And 3, that we've had a weakening of the institutions that allowed people through workplace pensions to be able to save on their own. And so if they're more responsible for their own savings, we've got to then make sure that they're well protected in that personal savings journey, right? And the reality is, if you frankly go into a bank branch today, I hate to say it, but you're going to basically see a person who's mostly a sales representative try to send you a very costly bank product that is largely just going to invest in the bank's own the bank's own products, right? And in some cases, that's fine for lots of people, but it's not necessarily the best performing. It's not necessarily the least costly. It's not necessarily the best product for you. And so if we don't back up in a system where we rely on personal responsibility, we don't back that up with adequate consumer protection, right? And we don't have adequate levels of financial literacy in this country, which, as Jen's own research has shown, is a real problem for some people. And they don't have wages that are going to generate the kinds of levels of savings that will match their future retirement prospects, then we're going to face a problem. And that becomes a really big economic problem when more and more people are going to be around in older age, right? And that's actually what the solution to the expanding the Canada Pension Plan is all about. It's about addressing the fact that it's really hard to create those other catches for people that will protect them, and it's simpler just to provide broader coverage.
Okay, so it was mentioned earlier in this show, generational fairness, and as much as I might be sympathetic to the plight of seniors, and I am as I approach it, and I worry about my savings running out, which is why I smoke. So I can be as sympathetic as I want, but honest to God, how do seniors compare financially to other age cohorts in the country?
You want some data?
Particularly to young people.
I didn't cut it by young people. I'm sorry. I've got working age and I've got seniors. So I've got working age 25 to 64 and then 65 plus.
Yeah.
That's what I was able to do in time for today. Okay. So let's see here. We've already talked about poverty rates, right? So seniors, 6%, working age adults, twice that at 11. Almost twice that at 11. Median income for a senior in Canada is about 33,000. This is before taxes. Working age adults about 51. But as you go kind of up the income threshold, like at sort of like the top 75, top 90, top 95, the gap between those incomes actually shrinks, which is kind of interesting. Let's talk about their debt. I mentioned before, seniors at the median have no debt. A working age adult has 51,700, so they could pay off their entire debt if they just spent no other money than all of the things that they earned in the year. Right, I mentioned before as well, seniors are significantly more likely to own the home that they live in. And if they own their home, they are very unlikely to be carrying a mortgage, compared to working age adults. And then last but not least, their overall net worth. This is including whatever employer pensions they're pulling down, as well as after paying off any debts. A median senior in Canada has a net worth of just under $500,000 at $496,000, compared to a working age adult at $300,000. And again, that's factoring in like the value of housing and all the rest of it. But there's below that, in terms of the working age adults, that median is also covering up an awful lot of zeros, right, of working age adults that have no net worth whatsoever.
Right.
But
Right.
Jennifer, I think correct me if I'm wrong, if we looked at the growth of wealth between cohorts, as in to say, are today's seniors experiencing a boom of wealth compared to earlier generations of seniors, and what is the distribution of that wealth between today's seniors and today's youth? I think it's correct that while today's young workers are actually out earning their peers, right? They're actually earning more at these younger ages in the labor market than those who came before them. Seniors have become significantly wealthy over time, in part because they've really benefited from the booming stock market in the last number of decades. And I think the challenge for young people is that, they're kind of faced with a choice, which is, do you want to save for a house, which is increasingly very hard to save for, or do you want to invest in the stock market? And in some ways, we actually maybe should be encouraging more people to go into the market, even if that doesn't accord with the middle class lifestyle that many people want.
So what if I said to you, young people are the authors of their own misfortune? Yeah.
Well,
They don't. We talked earlier about how they won't save unless you force them to. The other thing they won't do is vote. So this Bloc measure got the support of 3 parties in the House of Commons, and the only thing that surprised me about that was that it didn't get the support of 4. And in part that's because, not exclusively, but in part that's because older Canadians are at least twice as likely to vote as young Canadians are in an election campaign. And so they're a much more powerful political bloc.
Yeah, there's a lot of research, not just in Canada, but around the advanced world, right, about the interrelationship between the voting patterns of young people and old people, and the extent to which that influences policy outcomes. That just seems axiomatic. I think one question I've been thinking a bit about, be interested in Tyler's views about this. The Conservative Party of Canada is doing something that is unique around the Anglo-American world, which is to say it is outperforming center-left and progressive parties with younger voters. At least that's what these voters are telling pollsters.
Young men.
And the young men, fair enough. And the question is, how does the party go from translating that support at this stage to votes at the ballot box? In 2015, the Liberal Party had a set of policies as part of the party's overall platform that spoke directly to the kind of interests and galvanizing issues for that cohort. I think of marijuana legalization, electoral reform, etc. And so I think the Conservatives can't take for granted that the support that they presently have with this cohort is necessarily going to manifest itself on election day. And I think that they need to look at that 2015 Liberal platform and ask themselves, what are the conservative equivalents of marijuana legalization or electoral reform or whatever? One idea that I've advanced at the Hub, which you were so kind to mention, David, and it's a bit of a radical idea, but in a way, it's trying to speak to this question of intergenerational fairness. We have a lifetime capital gains exemption, of course. We don't have something like that when it comes to income taxation. And I can convince myself that one way to help those people as they transition from education into employment and they face these mix of demands on their resources, everything from saving for a home to investing in the stock market to paying off student debt to possibly paying for their children's childcare, on and on and on, is to essentially say your first $250,000 or whatever the number is of employment income is going to be tax-free. That we have a collective interest in supporting you during this period of formation. Not only do I think one could make a plausible policy case for something like that, it strikes me as the type of policy that could have a galvanizing effect on this voter cohort and ensure that they aren't simply telling pollsters that they like conservatives. They're reflecting that at the ballot box as well.
Okay. All right, let's bring this back to seniors, and let's bring it in for a landing. I'm going to ask you two questions, each of you two questions, one of which is, so the Bloc proposal, good policy or bad policy? I think I've got an idea what you're going to think about that, but I'd like to hear you say it. And then the second thing is, would you do anything at all for seniors? And if so, what would you do? Maybe we could start with you, Jennifer.
Okay. First one is easy. Bad policy. Bad policy. I'm not going to pronounce on the politics, whatever. I'll let other folks comment on that piece. What would I do instead? I got a list here. So number one, I would do a targeted boost to the GIS instead, right? So, something that would reach those 430,000 seniors that are still living in poverty. But I would also really make a push for full take-up of the GIS. There are still, unfortunately, some seniors in this country who, they're filing the tax returns, the government knows who they are and where they are, and they're eligible for the GIS and they're not getting it, right? So I would make a big push on that. The other thing that I would be thinking about is a specific program. Look, there's a big play right now in terms of housing and housing affordability, and a big focus on helping people move into their first home ownership, right? Because we're still kind of in a world of thinking about home ownership as the marker of you're a real grown-up now. But I think that there is another element here if we think about the suitability of our housing stock for an aging population, right? There are just not an awful lot of housing options, particularly for those seniors who are struggling, that are really purpose-built and meant for aging in place. And I think that that's a real challenge, especially, for those seniors who don't have the means to be able to afford to do the adaptations themselves. So a tax credit for, home renovations is just not going to do it for them. And then the last thing, but not least, and maybe this is because I'm a cranky Gen Xer, but I would say another piece that's going to get lost in this, if we're thinking about generational fairness and about, we're moving from a reality of having about 3 working age adults to seniors to closer to 2 in the not too distant future, is going to be thinking about the value of and the recognition of and supports for unpaid caregivers who are going to be disproportionately women who also have kids. And if we're worried about productivity, we cannot afford to have them exit the labor force. So that's my list.
Excellent. Cool. Sean, what about you?
It sucks. I've said it a couple of times. I keep following Jennifer, which is just it's a recipe for looking bad. The short answer on the
That's
OAS
really why you're on the show, to be honest, right? I mean, it's the Jennifer show, and you two guys are here to make her look good.
She brings the receipts. We don't bring that.
No. Of course. I think the Bloc motion and the accompanying private members bill is a bad idea. It's a bad idea, not just because, as we've discussed, I think it's unjustified, but that we have to understand these questions as matters of fiscal trade-offs. And you think about all of the demands facing the federal government, from defense to climate change, to, the list goes on. The idea that this is where the next incremental dollar ought to go is crazy. The politics is the only explanation because there's no evidentiary argument for it. On incremental policies, one idea that I'm intrigued by, and it speaks to something Jennifer mentioned earlier, is the medical expense tax credit. Is pretty parsimonious. It's pretty complex. It's non-refundable. I do think that there is a case that it ought to be reformed, make it refundable, make it much more generous. You could see a world where down the road, it almost serves the purpose of publicly subsidizing people to purchase private drug insurance who don't have it from an employer or through a public plan. If the means test was well designed, there'd be some people for whom you'd effectively be purchasing public or private insurance, and for others you'd have a kind of sliding scale of public support. I think that's one example of the type of way in which public policy can ultimately support the kind of exercise of personal responsibility for people to care for themselves in their senior years.
Interesting. Thanks, Sean. Tyler, what do you think?
Well, look, I've said earlier that I don't think that we are facing a fiscal cliff associated with seniors benefits. So I don't want people to assume that I don't think that there's a problem there. But I will just say, in terms of the specific OAS proposal that the Bloc has, I agree with my two other colleagues. I don't think that it's the best use of dollars, just because $16 billion or $18 billion, whatever the cost will be over 5 years, there's a lot of better uses for that money. And interestingly, on your question, David, about alternatives, there's a couple of ideas around seniors issues from the last campaign and the last 2021 Liberal platform that are not yet fulfilled, that actually would be the basis potentially for agreement, not only potentially with the Bloc, but also with the NDP, that I think the government ought to pursue. One of which is an expansion of the guaranteed income supplement, which would be on the margins a far better use of an incremental dollar, given that it's targeted on people who are the lowest income. And I think everyone will agree there's still probably some seniors, especially coming out of the inflationary crisis that we've experienced, that would benefit from some enhancement there that would be better used than giving something to everybody over the age of 65. And there's also a number of commitments associated with caregiving, including making the Canada Caregiver benefit and credit refundable, as well as also potentially expanding supports under the caregiving strategy that Minister O'Regan started last year and has not yet come forward with specifics. And I think there's a lot of work to be done both to support caregivers who are dealing with issues around staying in the economy, as well as also, frankly, as I said earlier, the costs of care are a significant burden that a lot of people face when they plan for their retirement. And if we want to deal with that effectively, if we want to make sure that those costs don't get passed on to people, that also means we've got to care for the care workforce, which means people who are PSWs who are not yet adequately compensated.
Yeah, that's how I would wrap this up, which is to say, I think you could relieve a lot of anxiety among older people if we fixed the places where they're going to end up. In those homes, we learned it in COVID and should have known it before, and nothing's been done after. But if you're going to end up in a home for low-income people, it's not a thing that people look forward to. It's a thing that people dread. Right?
Yeah. And honestly, keeping people in their homes for as long as possible and packaging services around them, far better in terms of outcomes for seniors and inclusion and all the rest of it.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I want to thank the three of you so much. Great conversation. Now it's time to go start picking up kids from ballet and getting turkey pieces in the oven. So thank the three of you for joining me this afternoon. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Tellus, and our sponsor, CN Rail, and all of you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened to the show. Thank you very much. I'm going to have these people back as much as I can because I'm smarter after each conversation. So thanks very much. Have a great weekend. Why,